Hello there, fellow explorer. This is Thomas speaking, and welcome to already the second episode of the Vintage Pilot School podcast, where you can join me in my quest to learn to fly a small aeroplane. And for that, I will be taking an unusual approach, because I will base myself as much as possible on a 1940s guidebook for British RAF pilots. In this episode, we take a trip to Kyiv in Ukraine, where somehow I ended up taking pictures of a young lady embracing a Soviet helicopter. Next to that, we will also learn something about flight instruments. So let's fasten our attention seatbelts and take off faster than a helium balloon that's just slipped out of a toddler's hands. Stick with me, it's going to be a good one. In the first episode, I already mentioned how I was going to learn to fly a plane using a small pocketbook from the 1940s called Teach Yourself to Fly, a guide written by the late Nigel Tanguy that was aimed at British Air Force volunteers. Now, some listeners have been very generous with their feedback on the first episode, mostly in the form of acronymous replies via social media. And as you might expect, most people think it is, of course, impossible, and I will crash land before I can even find the time to say OMG. That is to say, if I ever even manage to take off, which would be very LOL. And you might be right, there is plenty of madness to this method, I'm very well aware. The more I read in the old flying guidebook, the less confidence I have in being able to pull off even the most basic of flying maneuvers. Although it's probably best not to focus on this inversely proportional ratio too much, but keep studying the modern day theory on the side, of course. But first, something fun. Last week, I went on a mini break to Kyiv, the capital of Ukraine, to visit the State Aviation Museum, which has over 70 planes and choppers on display in its collection. So, let's find a fitting soundscape for Ukraine. Let's see. Yep, that's it. Except it isn't. Now that's more like it, because the centre of Kyiv struck me as a rather buzzing place, where centuries of history and Soviet remains form the backdrop to a new era that started after the independence and subsequent revolutions. So, plenty of new economic development, there's just a very long way to go still. You could even notice it from the air as we were approaching the airport in Kyiv, so vast forests interspersed with old Soviet-style apartment blocks, and then shiny new luxury apartments, all a bit in a strange mix together. And then, for example, upon landing, there's also this brand new terminal building that's only been open for a few years, and that stands in stark contrast with the ancient red tractors that are still being used to pull the baggage trolleys. And things are a bit like that everywhere, so plenty of new development, hipster bars, usually spurred by the younger generation, but sometimes you really have to look past the not-so-nice facades to find them, and then the state of some of the roads is absolutely ridiculous, but very interesting indeed. Anyway, during my time there, I decided to go on a small excursion to the State Aviation Museum, or as this Ukrainian robot voice will pronounce it more correctly,
Державний музей авіації України.
Yes, thank you. It is located right next to Kyiv's secondary airport called Giuliani, which is used mostly for business aviation. And if you have a strong death wish, I can fully recommend travelling to the Aviation Museum by taxi. The local algorithm of Uber appears to have been designed so that any driver who hasn't outright murdered any passengers in the past 2 days is automatically awarded a 5-star rating in the app. But in the end, I made it there just fine with Yuri, the stunt driver, and I soon found myself in front of a large and very unwelcoming entrance gate with right next to it an uninspiring prefab box that read ticket office in Ukrainian. It had the tiniest of ticket windows, actually pretty much just like every other museum that I'd come across so far in the city, and there was a young lady sat behind it who really looked bored out of her skull, and I couldn't really blame her. She shoved a plastic card with prices in front of my face, and she just said this one word, Gabin, just with a better accent. And what that meant is that apparently you could pay an extra 10 or 20 cents or so for the privilege to take a picture inside the cockpits of a few of the planes of your preference. But I kindly declined on that offer, and I walked through the gate with a disapproving look from the ticket girl. Now, the concept of a museum, to my admittedly very spoiled Belgian mind, conveys the image of a very tidy place with wheelchair access, a nice brochure here and there, and then some info signs that accompany all the things that are on display. There's usually also a cafe, a few museum guards, ushers doing the rounds to help you out if you have any questions, and at the end there will always be a gift shop selling a mix of slightly overpriced hardcover books and then also children's toys. The Aviation Museum in Kyiv operates in a slightly different way. It consists of a very large patch of grass with some concrete slabs, and then there are a total of 70 aeroplanes quite randomly distributed, and that's about it. Very, very minimal info. So, for example, there was an absolutely massive jetliner parked by the entrance, and all I got from the small sign next to it was its top speed, range, and number of aircraft built. Nothing else. The planes themselves were quite interesting, though. They ranged from early experimental aircraft to more modern amphibious planes, and even a United Nations transport chopper, the largest helicopter in the world. And as I was walking through that half-empty space, a girl walked up to me asking if I could take a few pictures of her. Next thing I knew, she put this enormous Canon camera into my hands, and then immediately she expertly draped herself all over a helicopter in a rather seductive pose. And then as soon as she heard the camera click, she swiftly went into another pose, this time properly hugging the airframe, and then another pose, and then another one. And for me personally, I was a little bit surprised, because if I was posing for pictures right next to a helicopter with a machine gun sticking out, I really wouldn't know how to behave other than perhaps a sheepish laugh. But this girl easily made herself the centre of the attention. Another cliché about Eastern Europe positively confirmed. All in all, the Aviation Museum is a lovely place to visit for aviation aficionados and anybody who wants to escape the busy centre of Kyiv. I really had a very nice time there. Whilst I was at the Aviation Museum, I also had a close look at a few of the flight decks inside the cockpit, and I tried to compare to what I've already tried to study from my 1940s flying guidebook. And what I saw, I have to admit, wasn't very motivating. Let's hear what it was like back in the day.
Have a look at the instrument board. In a training aeroplane, this is quite a simple affair and very different from the immensely complicated dashboard of an airliner. With the latter type of plane, a pilot has to watch his instruments carefully to fly in safety. But with a light plane, instruments are a mere help to the pilot, but not essential to him. There are 4 main dials: the airspeed indicator, altimeter, engine revolution counter, and oil pressure gauge.
And the book just goes on and on and on like that in a very light-hearted tone, I have to say. A training plane back in the day apparently only had 4 dials, 2 engine switches, a few pedals, fiddly buttons here and there, and that was about it. So the entire section on instruments and flight controls combined doesn't take more than 15 pages altogether, and everything is illustrated with 2 measly drawings. Not exactly the foundation that I would feel comfortable with as a basis for getting into a flying death machine. Now, in contrast, I received my 2018 study material the other week, and there is an entire book on instrumentation alone, weighing in at just under 100 pages, and that is just for basic daytime flying in small planes alone, nothing like a large jet. I really think I will have to give this chapter a miss in the old manual and try to study the modern-day guidebook on instruments, otherwise I will never be able to pass the exam. In addition to some studying, I will also have to start packing soon, because at the end of next week I will say goodbye to the lovely city of Ghent and move to the State Aviation Academy, which is located just west of Valencia. I have absolutely no idea what to expect, other than that it's undoubtedly going to be lots of fun, of course, and I also hope that they have a very good insurance policy, because it's not going to be easy, and if my driving skills have any predictive value, I might need a little bit of time to adapt. This will do for episode number 2. As always, feedback is most welcome. Please subscribe to the podcast and share it with your friends, family, housemates, or your dog. There is also a Facebook page called the Vintage Pilot School Podcast, and you can follow the blog to find some additional material and credits, including a picture of that helicopter that I mentioned, as well as a few more holiday snapshots of my time in Kyiv. For now, goodbye.